Hello and welcome to the Book Club Review. I'm Kate.
I'm Laura.
And this is the podcast about book clubs and the books that get you talking.
Today we bring you Bookshelf, an episode dedicated to the books we're each reading outside of book club, the ones we get to pick and choose.
And so, in my stack is Ghost Wall by Sarah Moss, Born to Run by Christopher McDougall, What I Talk About When I Talk About Running by Haruki Murakami, and Today Will Be Different by Maria Semple.
And in my stack I have Heartburn by Nora Ephron, You Think It, I'll Say It by Curtis Sittenfeld, The Western Wind by Samantha Harvey, and The Mermaid and Mrs. Hancock by Imogen Hermes Gowar.
Keep listening to hear what we thought of them and whether there might be any gems in here for your next book club pick.
All that coming up here on the Book Club Review.
I haven't seen you for a while. I'm dying to hear what you've been reading.
Well, shall we start with Nora Ephron?
Okay. Now, the reason you read that is because I recommended it.
Exactly. And you had just read it and loved it, as I recall.
I did love it, yeah. I thought it was short and sharp and funny and didn't outstay its welcome. It was good. I liked it.
It is a definite speed read. You gave it to me because I'd been slogging through something and you were like, no, take this home. And I think I finished it in 24 hours or so. So this is Heartburn by Nora Ephron. And it is fiction, but also very autobiographical.
Yeah, lightly fictionalized is how she describes it.
And it's the story of Rachel, who's kind of Nora, but in a fictionalized form. And Rachel is a very successful cookbook author who, at 7 months pregnant, I believe, finds out that her husband is having an affair with another woman. And not only that, when she confronts him, he says that he loves this other woman and he's not going to end the affair. And this actually happened to Nora Ephron.
When she was 7 months pregnant.
Exactly.
That's the humdinger.
Nora Ephron makes this into quite a funny story. And my favourite bit actually is at the very end when she talks about owning her story. And if she didn't laugh, then she would just cry. And actually she wants to own the story as this kind of horrific, but ultimately slightly amusing interlude or ridiculous, absurd experience in her life that she got over. Did it make her stronger? Who knows? She's not that kind of writer, is she? She's not that kind of figure. Nora Ephron is much better known for her films and the scripts she wrote.
When Harry Met Sally, Sleepless in Seattle.
Exactly.
That one about Julia Child.
And I mean, I do like those films. I did find Heartburn quite dated. I think this happened, she wrote it in the early 1980s. And this happened to her in 1978 or thereabouts. And just her pronouncements on men and women and how they interact didn't feel true today. And it probably is generational.
Yeah, I didn't feel it was particularly relatable. It's a very affluent, upper middle class. You know, they don't really have that in America, do they? But you know what I mean.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
She's talking about parties where it's with the ambassador and the ambassador's wife and the Washington political scene. And
no one's likable and they're all quite selfish. And even her relationship with her husband, it's both of their second marriages and it's only been going for like 2 or 3 years. And it just feels a little bit artificial, like they haven't really known each other at all.
Yeah, I didn't really think about that too much. I think she's likeable. I liked her.
Yeah, I suppose so.
Come on, let's come out and say it. Did you hate it?
I didn't hate it. I just found it a little bit tiresome and self-indulgent.
Ooh.
Well, which sounds really cruel because, of course, it's her story, and I respect the fact she told it. But you're right. This rich middle class, it is upper class milieu, and their preoccupations and their affairs. I was reading something about how millennials have very little patience with extramarital affairs because we've grown up in a different age where if you're not happy in your relationship, end it. Don't lie. Don't go off and have an affair. Like, that's tawdry and deceptive, and you don't need to do that anymore. There's no stigma in getting divorced.
Right.
And actually, older generations' view of affairs was that they were a bit more kind of exciting and tantalizing and risque, but not with the same sort of guilt associated with them. I don't know if this is true. I mean, it was something I read in passing.
Well, you know what this makes me think? It makes me think it would be a really good book club book.
And also, I think, too, if you had people in your group, different ages, different sexes, it would lead to a great discussion.
Well, that actually would lead me on quite nicely to Ghost Wall by Sarah Moss. I have joined another book club.
I know. You're crazy.
Only because I was asked, and I was so flattered and excited to be asked. And it's with a group of mums from my school. Actually, they're not all from my school, but a group of women who I don't know that well. And I just thought, how brilliant, it'd be a lovely way of getting to know them. And it's quite nice to go to a book club that's not mine and sort of, see how they do it. And they picked Ghost Wall by Sarah Moss, which I happily read. It's quite short. And I hadn't really got any expectations about it. And I just opened it and it has the most extraordinary opener that just pulled me in. And I was gripped from the first few pages. And it has this kind of intensity to it that just carries you through and doesn't put you down. And I love it when a book does that. It's the story of Sylvie, who is on a sort of camping holiday with her mother and father, except that this is camping with a difference. They are living a kind of archaeological experiment. They are living like Iron Age tribes people with an archaeology professor and 3 students. And it's an exercise in attempting to live the way that people of the past lived. So they're up there on the Northumbrian moors, living in a kind of yurt, and they have to eat what they can catch or gather, and it's all pretty hard, kind of a test of endurance. But what's really interesting is all the things that come out of this setup. So very quickly, the camp falls into gender lines and the women are left doing the actual gathering and cooking and all the kind of menial tasks that keep the camp functioning, while the men go off and sort of play at being hunters. And then the things that they bring back, there's a sort of quite visceral scene where Sylvie ends up having to sort of, gut some rabbits. And the key figure here is the father, who is quite a dark, menacing presence. From the very early on, you sense the kind of threat in him. And very quickly you realise that it's a relationship based on bullying and power and violence, unfortunately. And Sylvie and her mother are both the victims of that. And then this overlays a sort of historical story, not really a story, but it keeps just touching back on the ancient past and these bog people, we call them now, these people who are found, who've been buried thousands of years, and why were they there? And we understand that they were sacrificed. And so there's this idea about these ancient tribes people who sacrificed living beings, people who were precious and had meaning to them, and yet were sacrificed for some idea of greater good, we don't know. And then coming back to this present day story of this young girl in this situation with this very problematic father, and it sort of spirals in a really interesting way, and you don't quite know where it's going to end up, and it's just captivating. And she writes beautifully, and her sense of place is extraordinary. You feel like you're there, you feel like you're walking the trails, the heat of it set in the summer. Such an interesting book, such a great read, and then a really interesting discussion book we discovered.
I was going to ask, you had the discussion.
Yeah, really good, because there's so many different threads to pull out of it. As I said, there's a sort of gender thing, interesting sideline about Brexit, but about identity and national identity and Britishness and what it means. The father is sort of very drawn to this idea of the past because he sees that as a kind of almost like a racial purity. And almost this sense of people clinging to kind of slightly mad ideas because the modern world is so sort of crazy and strange that they latch onto that thinking that that's something true and blind belief. And then where that can lead you, it leads to very difficult, uncomfortable places. I absolutely loved reading it, and I do think it would be a brilliant book club book. Recommended.
I might give it a try. It's nice and short too.
Short and sweet.
And we seem to be on a roll because that book leads quite well into The Western Wind by Samantha Harvey. Now, this is a historical novel set in 15th century Somerset in a tiny little village which is cut off from all the other villages by a big river. And the wealthiest man in the village, Thomas Newman, in partnership with the village priest, John Reeve, have been trying to build a bridge across this river. And this novel is set across just 4 days, and it's 4 days of trying to figure out what happened to Thomas Newman because he's disappeared and someone saw a man in the river and, no one knows what happened. Now, John Reeve is taking confession because it's in the lead up to Shrove Tuesday, Pancake Tuesday, and he's trying to figure out what happened, or is he? Because actually, this book is set across 4 days and it works its way back in time. And on day 4, the beginning of the novel, the priest is under huge pressure from the dean who has come to investigate the disappearance of Thomas Newman. And he firmly believes that Thomas Newman has been murdered. He was the wealthiest man in the village. He owned the tenancies to all of the local villagers. He was a very good man, much loved. This isn't likely to have been an accident, and surely it couldn't have been suicide. Something must have gone wrong. And so the dean is like, you must tell me, report back to me what everyone is saying in confession. That's day 4, the very beginning of the novel. And then it works back in time to day 1, the day that Thomas Newman disappeared. Now, that sounds quite thrilling, or it sounds quite interesting.
Yeah.
It's incredibly slow.
Right.
And I picked this up at Waterstones thinking, this sounds great. It's got huge acclaim on it.
Yeah, it does have a lovely cover.
A beautiful cover, which is a woodcut showing a river and a tree and actually all the elements. And that's what made me think of Ghostwall, because you were talking about the existence that these prehistoric people would have lived through. Well, that's set in the summer. This is set in February in England,
Right.
in the rain. And it's called the Western Wind because the priest is looking for a sign from God. And he believes that Thomas Newman will have made it out of purgatory and into heaven if the western wind blows. That's what he's looking for. And that's what's so powerful about this novel, even though it is really, really slow, is the true belief that people had at that time in purgatory, in hell, in the power of God.
They didn't have Netflix or Amazon Prime.
They had no other references for understanding their world, and their world was so small. Their community was so small, and this community is so isolated and vulnerable. And this dean coming in with the conviction that someone has killed this man puts them at great risk. I can't quite decide if it would be a good book club book. As I say, I found it incredibly slow, and it took me about 3 weeks to read it because I was just like, oh God, we're back in the confession box. Oh God, it's still raining. It's still cold. Everyone's wet. It's so miserable. How on earth did they live through this? And in that sense, I agree with the quote on the back that says, less like reading a novel and more akin to time travel, because you do feel like you're there and you realize how, again, the word miserable life could have been at that time, would have been, especially in February. February is bad enough in London in the 21st century. Imagine February in the countryside without any central heating, without any insulation, just bleak.
A wise, wild and beautiful book, someone said on the cover.
A rich and sumptuous delight, says the Daily Telegraph. Wonderful, says the Financial Times.
So we say maybe good for book club?
Maybe, given that all those people thought it's incredible and I found it a bit of a slog.
There'd definitely be some good debate.
It might well be, if anyone finishes it.
Okay. Well, okay, so we've got the elements, haven't we? And we've got the ancient past. And I read a book that has been my book. I get a bit kind of carried away sometimes by things that I read. The Sleep book definitely took me on a real journey. Couldn't stop talking to people about the Sleep book. And then I read a book called Born to Run by Christopher McDougall. Natalie in my book club once pitched this to us as a, let's do it, it'll be good for book club. And it was rejected because it's a book about running and no one wanted to read a book about running. And then I came across it in the charity shop and idly picked it up and thought, I'll have a look and see why she thought it was so good. And took it home and opened it and started reading. Christopher McDougall is a journalist who has written for a lot of men's magazines. He's been a war correspondent. He's sort of specialised in going out and doing incredibly macho things, covering these sort of things. And then he gets into the world of ultra running, provoked mainly by a very simple question, which is he injured his foot and he wanted to know why his foot hurt. And it takes him on this journey of examining why runners get injured so much, because it is totally standard. I did the park run this morning and I was having a chat with my friend of mine who was telling me about an injury to her foot. It's just totally standard. Runners get injured all the time. But why is that? How odd. Why should we get injured just by running?
Were we not born to run?
Well, this is the thing. And so there are some really interesting strands to this book, because on the one hand, it's a sort of investigation into running shoes. Now, if you think about how long human beings have been around and how long we've had modern day running shoes, you can see that they're a fairly recent phenomenon. And actually, there's a very persuasive argument to say that we were not designed to run in cushioned soles. When we run, our feet are seeking a stable, flat surface, and there's a reason that we have so many nerves in our feet, and that's because we need to be able to sense the surface that we're on so that our bodies can micro-adjust as we run, and that means that we won't get injured. And when we pad our feet with cushioned soles, what we're doing is we're taking away the body's sensory system, its warning system. And so there is a really interesting thread about that.
That's really interesting, just to interject, because I've been listening to the founder of Nike's biography, Shoe Dog.
Oh, right, yeah.
which is about almost inventing the category of running shoes in the 1960s. And before that, people didn't really wear, well, they wore shoes, obviously, but there weren't that many running shoes out there.
That's the thing. So Roger Bannister, when he did his 4-minute mile, did it in a sort of plimsolls.
And now, funnily enough, it's come full circle. You know, Nike was founded in Oregon. And the last time I was in Oregon, there was some young man running past me on the trail in bare feet.
He probably read this book. So there's this incredibly persuasive argument about barefoot running and why that might actually be better for us. He then goes off to investigate this tribe, this reclusive tribe, this incredibly remote area of Mexico, which is not uninhabited. This tribe of people live there, the Tarahumara, they're called. They just don't really have much contact with the outside world. And he seeks them out. He finds a way in and he seeks them out. And the reason he's so interested to go and meet them is because he has heard that they are incredible runners. And this proves to be true. This is a tribe of people for whom running is as obvious to them as eating or sleeping. It is just what they do. And running extraordinary distances as well. You know, they would think nothing of running sort of 50 miles in a day.
Do they run with purpose?
Well,
as in to get somewhere?
Both, I think. I think partly just for the joy of running, partly to get places. Yeah, it's funny. He doesn't actually specifically, I think, go into why they run. They just run. But then I suppose in a way, the overall arc of the book, by the time you finish the book, you kind of get it. You understand why anyone runs. What I loved about this book is it took all of my ideas about running and it threw them up in the air. And when they fell back down, they were in a different place. And I had a totally different idea about running from the way I had before. And that wasn't because he'd force-fed me a sort of, you know, a didactic theory about what running should be. It's more that he'd just given me all this information and he told me this fantastic story with these amazing characters, and it ends up with this ultra run organised with the Tarahumara and this reclusive guy called Cabello Blanco, the white horse, who is going to be played by Matthew McConaughey in the movie, apparently, who goes and seeks them out and goes and lives with them, and then they organise this extraordinary race at the end, and Christopher McDougall takes part in it. You know, he's kind of gone sufficiently far on this journey that he wants to be in it. And then at the end, it gets into our ancient past and why we ran. And I think it's a theory that's reasonably out there now, but the idea that in order to get our protein that we needed, we didn't have bows and arrows back then, or even spears. You know, how did we get food before we had those things? And again, it's a very persuasive argument that what we did is we chased the antelopes until they fell over. And the reason we can do that is because human beings have the ability to sweat, which no other animals have. And what that means is that we can keep going and we can keep running. And it wasn't just the fast, strong men of the tribe who would be doing this. There's no point running 70 miles to catch an antelope if then everybody else in the tribe is 70 miles away.
Right.
Everybody went. The old people, the women, the children, everybody went. And it's just so interesting. I love this book so much. I cannot stop talking about it to people. I've already had 2 copies that I've bought and then given away to people.
So did you guys make a mistake when Natalie suggested it and you said, no, we don't want to read that?
Yeah, I think so. I think I should run it past them again.
It sounds good. I'm intrigued.
And I think I loved it because I didn't feel like it was just a book for people who were interested in running. I thought there was just so much in there that, you know, it would be a book for anybody. I loved it. I really loved it.
And then you have another running-related book in your stack.
Well, so then people I chatted to about Born on the Run would say to me, oh, have you read the Murakami book? I'd say, oh, well, I'm not really crazy about Murakami. They'd be like, no, this book isn't like other Murakami books. So Japanese novelist Haruki Murakami wrote a book called What I Talk About When I Talk About Running. So he famously, if you know about these things, is a novelist, but also a runner. He started running in his late 20s and, you know, was sort of a kind of hour a day kind of a guy. What to me would already be quite an extreme form of running. You know, I'll pad around the park, run and maybe do a couple during the week. But, you know, that to me is very intense. But anyway, he sort of started off doing that. And then he progressed to marathons. And to this day, he runs 1 marathon a year. And sometimes I think he would even do more than that. He would do 1 or 2.
How old is he?
Oh, ask me a technical question.
Sorry.
When was he born? 1949?
Oh, no, he's in almost 70.
Yeah, I hadn't realised.
So pretend I've
But you
just
know
asked.
what, though? That supports McDougall's theory about, you know, you've got your 70-year-old man who's still running ultra marathons. His point is, this is what we were born to do, Laura. You know what? Everything I loved about the McDougall book is absent in the Murakami book. I mean, I have read a few Murakami novels. I am very interested in all things Japanese, and I love reading, and
he's much acclaimed.
A cult following. I mean, people queue up for hours outside bookstores when a new book of his comes along. But my reaction to every book of his I've ever read has been a great big meh, you know. His characters never grab me. I'm never really that drawn in. He writes in this really sort of flat, expressionless style. I think this is summed up for me by, I think the most recent one. No, not the most recent one, because there's a new one that's come out, isn't it? Commodore or something. But the one I read was Colourless Zuki and his pilgrimage. Or I can't remember. That's the point. I can't remember. I remember the cover. That's why I bought it, because it had a really nice sort of like a colour wheel on it. And I am a graphic designer and I'm like a magpie to these things. Anyway, point being, that was about a character who was just so boring and unemotional that it's almost like he didn't exist, and the novel kind of explored that. I mean, this is sort of feels like Murakami's soul, I don't know. And so this book about running, you know, you wouldn't think it was possible to write a really boring book about running.
Wouldn't you?
Murakami managed it. And I think the problem is it's just a series of statements and there's no analysis or interpretation. It came to life for me slightly when he talks about running an ultramarathon around a lake in Hokkaido. And I think an ultramarathon is sort of 50 plus miles. And he wrote quite well about that. But what was interesting is after 26.5 miles, which I think is a marathon distance, apparently there's a line that sort of says that on the pavement and you cross it. And then you know that every step after that, you're running beyond your what would for you be a normal marathon distance. And he's quite interesting about what happens. You know, your body kind of starts to scream in agony and say, why are we doing this? We have to stop, we have to stop, we have to stop. But if you push on through that, then you attain a kind of Zen-like state where you're sort of running in this extraordinary void. And he writes about how he's sort of running to acquire that void, that somehow is essential to him as a person, and that's something about that enables him to write, that sense of space and emptiness. And I was like, yep.
That's my reation when you say that. I'm like, oh.
Makes a lot of sense. I feel like there's a bit too much space and emptiness in your novels, and indeed in this book about running. So I can't recommend the McDougall book highly enough. Passion, joy, just so vivid and wonderful to read, even if you've got no intention of ever running a step. Murakami, I wonder if it might appeal to very, very serious distance runners, because there's something about, I suppose, mildly inspiring about seeing someone's record of how they did that. But really, you know,
they don't have any time to read books anyway.
No, I know.
Because whenever anyone trains for a marathon, they just vanish off the face of the planet anyway, don't they? It always seems to me like the most solitary and selfish of all physical activity.
Anyway, I've got to stop reading books about running. Even now, I'm reading a book about fell running, because Andy, who I was chatting to about Born to Run, which I think, has he read that? I think he was saying he has read it, but then he was saying, have you read Feet in the Clouds?
This is Andy from your book club.
Yeah. Sorry, like, you know, but our listeners wouldn't necessarily know. So Andy's often a very, very good source of book recommendations, said, have you read Feet in the Clouds? And that is a book about fell running in the Peak District and various, it's basically when you run up and down mountains.
I'm up for that. As a hiker, I think running up and down mountains sounds fantastic. It's running on flat surfaces, monotonous scenery that I'm like, oh, for the love of God, how boring.
Oh, well, maybe fell running is for you, because that is what it's all about.
There's no fells in London.
No, you have to travel to the fells, and then when you get there, you have to spend, well, if you're this author, you have to spend days of your life running up and down them as fast as you can. Again, he's a journalist and he writes about it really, really well. So I have to say I am really enjoying it. But I think what I've discovered is that there is just a delicious pleasure in lying in your warm, cosy bed and reading about people doing extreme forms of physical exertion. There's just something about it. It's I'm hooked.
I don't disagree with you. It's like reading about people suffering hardships on like expeditions. You know, remember The Snow Leopard, my favourite book ever?
The Snow Leopard, yeah.
You know, that's up in the mountains of the Himalayas and extreme cold. Love that book.
Sarah Wheeler's Terra Incognita, much loved book of mine, where she takes that thing about the Victorian explorers, the polar explorers who went out there to see how dead they could get. And again, like, just a really entertaining read about people doing things that you just never do in a million years. Anyway, yes, I suspect the fell running book won't be on our book club list anytime soon. But Christopher McDougall, Born to Run, I think would make a fantastic book club book.
Well, if you've been on a running kick, I've been on a historical novel kick. And when I bought The Western Wind, which I haven't mentioned was compared to the work of Hilary Mantel, of whom I'm a very big fan.
Oh.
The other book I picked up, which is The Mermaid and Mrs. Hancock by Imogen Hermes Gowar, was compared to The Miniaturist by Jessie Burton and The Essex Serpent by Sarah Perry. And you're smiling because you might know that I hate those books.
I remembered you hating those books.
I love historical fiction.
The Miniaturist was famously...
I despise The Miniaturist. If you're listening, you probably loved it because most of the world did. What I say to you is The Miniaturist did not need to exist in that book. That character makes no sense and does absolutely nothing to the plot. And it's silly.
But I like the Essex
and
Serpent.
Anachronistic.
We had a debate about the Essex Serpent, didn't we? Because I kind of liked it a lot more than you did.
The Essex Serpent is also incredibly anachronistic and obnoxious, with the characters acting as if they're 21st century liberals set in, early 19th century England.
It was a beautiful, atmospheric read, although
silly.
I would concede not without some flaws. But anyway, tell us about this one then.
But I decided that, I wouldn't hold those two references against this author, Imogen Hermes Gowar.
That's very open-minded of you.
And also, despite the very gendered, shiny, miniaturist-like cover, I was like, you know what? 18th century London, this sounds like fun. I'm going to pick it up. It was shortlisted for the Women's Prize for Fiction in 2018, and I loved it.
Oh, good.
It was such a great story, such a great read. She's not as good as Philip Pullman, but you know how Philip Pullman's books kind of wrap you up in this world and you know the characters and you care a lot about what's happening and they're such page turners even though there's no necessarily narrative tension. Like you're not reading because you've been manipulated into like wanting to find out what's going to happen. You're reading for the pleasure of that world. That's what this book was like.
Great.
And it's not perfect by any means, but she does quite a subtle job of exploring what it would have been like to be a woman in 18th century London. The main female character is Angelica Neal, who is a very high class whore, effectively. She's been raised in a, I hate the word whorehouse, but I mean, that's what it was. I think maybe there was another word for it, but it escapes me. She's been raised there, groomed to be the mistress of very, very wealthy, rich and powerful men. And then the other character is merchant Jonah Hancock, who is brought a mermaid in the opening chapter. Like, what? What do you mean? A mermaid? He's brought a stuffed mermaid-like goblin creature, and his captain has sold his boat to buy this mermaid. And Jonah Hancock is like, why? Why would you do that? That's bad. But actually, his captain was onto something because it's an oddity, and he's actually going to make his fortune from this mermaid, and his path is going to cross with Angelica Neal's. It's really wonderful. I don't know if it is a good book club book because I feel like if you picked it apart too much, you might not enjoy it as much. But I'd highly recommend it. It has a bit of the Georgette hair to it, but with much better
Love that.
feminist politics. Much less questionable.
Great. Oh, it's good because I did see it. It was sort of all over Instagram, wasn't it, when it came out? I just never really got round to it. It's quite long, isn't it? Is it sort of page turning?
Yeah, it's very page turning.
I think I was slightly daunted by its length. But
no, it's a great page turner, and it was such a reward after the very hard slog of The Western Wind, which might be a classier novel, but was quite hard work.
Oh, that sounds good. I also, for sort of light reading, I picked up, again in the charity bookshop, Today Will Be Different by Maria Semple. We read her first novel, Where'd You Go, Bernadette, for book club a long time ago. I, funnily enough, didn't like it that much at the time. I got really frustrated with it. But weirdly, in retrospect, I found myself liking it more. I remember it very fondly for some reason. And I did enjoy reading it at the same time as I felt like it was a bit flawed. And Maria Semple is a screenwriter and comedian, and she's very funny and good. And I suppose perhaps because I got to know a bit more about her, I slightly reevaluated Bernadette. Anyway, I was intrigued to read Today Will Be Different. Where'd You Go, Bernadette follows the story of a family where the mother has disappeared and the child and the father are sort of looking for her, trying to figure out what's happened. In Today Will Be Different, it's also someone who's disappeared. This time it's the dad. And it's set over a much shorter period. It's just 24 hours. And it's the mum and her son who are looking for him. And it's quite light. It's quite funny. She's very good at the sort of observational stuff. But there's so little to it.
Is it set in Seattle again?
Yes, set in
Interesting.
Seattle. So Bernadette famously hated Seattle. This character doesn't seem to mind Seattle. I think she quite likes it.
I'd like to borrow it.
Does Maria Semple live in Seattle? Maybe
I think she does, yeah. And my brother lives in Seattle, so I spend a lot of time there.
Maybe you have to live in Seattle to really appreciate the humour. I mean, I liked it. It was perfectly fine, but I didn't think there was much to it. And it goes to quite an odd place at the end that I hadn't seen coming, and I felt really let down by. I just was like, oh, why did she go there?
She does that, though. That was the thing about Where'd You Go, Bernadette, is that it became quite ridiculous. And a lot of people found that deeply annoying, whereas I just kind of went with it and thought it was amusing.
This is a bit strange. There's a bit quite early on that refers back to Bernadette in a very clever, very subtle way that had me laughing out loud, and for the sort of fond reminiscences of Bernadette. This book that actually at the time I wasn't that crazy about. But anyway, so Maria Semple, yeah, not for book club.
No?
Just a very light, diverting read.
Okay, I'm going to borrow it off you.
Yeah, you take it. Wow, that's it, is it?
Not quite.
Okay.
One final book.
Yeah.
Another American author. We've been quite split today, or at least we've covered off the Americans with Maria Semple, Nora Ephron, and now Curtis Sittenfeld. And actually, Curtis Sittenfeld feels like an author who sort of picks up on what Nora Ephron was doing back in the 1970s and 80s, but brings it up to the present day. And actually, she's a much, much better writer. She's fantastic.
She is good. I do like her.
Have you read American Wife?
The only one I've read of hers is Prep, but I loved Prep. Oh, no, that's not true.
You read Eligible, didn't you?
I hated Eligible, but I don't hold that against her because that was a kind of a weird retelling of Pride and Prejudice. That was sort of a project of, I think they got different writers to rewrite Jane Austen's novel. And I think I had a huge problem with that whole project anyway, like conceptually. And then I just thought she did a really bad job of it. But I loved Prep and the one about the sisters. Can't remember what that's called. Sisterland.
Yeah, that's right. I haven't read that one.
Yeah, I didn't like it as much as Prep, but...
Well, this is a collection of short stories, and I don't always love short stories, although I feel like they're getting better. I don't know. Maybe I'm getting older. Maybe I'm a more mature reader now. My colleague brought this in for me and said, you should take this off me for a little while.
You get good book recommendations through your work.
I do.
This is what I miss by not having an office.
Always from the same friend, Orla. She's fantastic. She's like my book pusher. Yeah. And beautiful book too. Nice hardback. Really powerful, creepy. I say creepy, not creepy in like a sinister way, but in this sort of unsettling, visceral feeling you get from reading these stories. And there's nothing that horrible happening in the stories, but Curtis Sittenfeld really zooms in on a moment in a relationship between two individuals. And they're quite difficult to describe. So maybe just like a scenario, for example. One is about a Texan housewife. This is actually the title story, You Think It, I'll Say It. And whenever she's at barbecues, with all the local families and so forth, the husband of one of the other women there comes to and stands next to her and says, you think it, I'll say it. And somehow they've slipped into this game where she will say what he's thinking. That's kind of the reason why this book is You Think It, I'll Say It. And this woman will kind of harpoon the different people and individuals at this barbecue, and their idiosyncrasies and ridiculous upper middle class lives in Texas. And she thinks actually that this is the beginning of a love affair. And actually she's completely got the wrong end of the stick. And how that plays out is just excruciating, even as it's really, really banal. There's another one where it's a journalist who's going to interview a Hollywood actress, and that interaction just completely unravels. So nothing happens, and yet they're just really, really fraught and creepy, and it would be such a good book club book because I think everything's really recognizable in your own life and at the same time quite disturbing. She's very good.
I need book clubs to make me read short stories. I never read short stories left to my own devices.
I think you would read them though because they're gripping.
Yeah, well,
they're actually gripping.
For a book club, I'd read them very happily.
I didn't, to be fair, I didn't finish it in its entirety because just towards the end I started to get a little bit queasy, and I was talking about it with my colleague Orla, and I was like, I just feel like I've been spending time with some really horrible people, but actually there's nothing that horrible about them. And because they're so recognizable, I've started just to kind of feel horrible myself. Like, oh God, like, is this what middle class affluent people are like in the 21st century? Oh, we're intolerable.
Intriguing.
Yeah.
And a nice typographic cover, which I like. It says it made the Sunday Times EFG Short Story Award. It made the 2018 shortlist. Have they announced that yet? They must have done. We're now in 2019.
So that's everything we've read.
Yes, I just brought along to show you. It was my husband Ted's birthday a couple of weeks ago, and one of his friends, who has obviously forgotten what Ted is like, because, they don't get together that often anymore, gave him for his birthday this trilogy of books by a Chinese author. I understand his name is pronounced Cixin Liu, and they are The Three-Body Problem, Death's End, and The Dark Forest. I brought them along to show you because I know that you love sci-fi and
I
fantasy.
have read the first one.
Oh, have you?
Yes, I
Which
have.
is the first one then? Because I've been reading The Three-Body Problem. I wasn't quite sure where to start.
The husband of Liz in your book club lent them to me. A long time ago.
I knew it was familiar.
A long time ago.
I had this feeling of I know someone's told me these are good. Well,
And they're a big deal. He won the Hugo Award for this series, and it's the first real crossover,
Oh my
I think,
goodness.
of Chinese literature.
look whose quote is on the front cover of that
Barack
one.
Obama, wildly imaginative, really interesting.
I love the fact that he's gone from leading the free world to writing blurb for book covers. But so I started The Three-Body Problem because Ted's not going to read them, and I thought, well, maybe I'll look into them. Actually, he's good. I'm really hooked. The characters are convincing. I'm really intrigued about where it's going, the setup. It's a good page turner. Nothing particularly fantastical has happened in this one yet, but I feel like, well, where's it going? Surely at some point aliens are going to arrive.
I did enjoy that one, especially because it starts, doesn't it, in 1970s China.
And having read
Do Not Say We Have Nothing
exactly
by Madeline Tien.
which has given me the background, I was super intrigued and just like, oh right, where is this going? Because it's sort of set. It starts off in recent Chinese history, and so very intriguing. And thank you very much, Rufus, for giving Ted these books.
Kate will enjoy them.
That's all for this episode. On our next book club show, we'll be discussing A Different Drummer by William Melvin Kelly. It's the latest book read by Laura's book club, a forgotten classic resurrected by a recent New Yorker article. We're pairing that up with If Beale Street Could Talk by William Baldwin, which was my last book club read. Both books are highly thought of, but did they make for good book club books? Listen in to find out.
And if you missed it, do check out our latest interview with Simon Thomas of the Stuck in a Book blog and podcast Tea or Books. He told us about his Book of the Year club, in which the clever use of the internet brings book bloggers together to read and review books from the past. If you're looking for a book club read a bit off the beaten track, this is a great place to start. Listen in to hear all about it.
Finally, if you'd like to see what we're up to between episodes, follow us on Instagram or Facebook at Book Club Review Podcast, on Twitter at Book Club RVW Pod, or email thebookclubreview@gmail.com. Write to us and let us know about your book club. We would love to hear.
And if you're not already, why not subscribe to us on iTunes or wherever you get your podcasts?
But for now, thanks for listening and happy reading.